Hi everybody, and welcome to Teams Governance and Lifecycle Essentials. I am Loryan Strant and I'll be taking you through this today. I'm sporting a lovely different hairdo from what you may have seen previously. So apologies if how that looks on the slides. So today I'm going to be taking you through Teams Governance and Lifecycle Essentials. Now, before we get started, what we need to appreciate is the traditional owners of our land. Now, you may have seen this in a number of slides. We are trying to do this in every session as possible. So we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which this online conference is hosted, and the traditional custodians of the lands where our Australian-based speakers, like myself and participants, are located. We would also like to pay our respects to the elders past, present, and future. Now, in terms of, we have a code of conduct that's available on our website, so hopefully you don't hear any disparaging things from myself or anybody else. If you do hear that, please reach out. So I'm going to skip because this is a short session. A little bit about myself. So as I said, when I jumped in, that I have a little bit less hair than what that particular photo actually shows. And so, look, I've been working with Office 365 for many, many years, since it used to be called BPOS. It is now Microsoft 365, and it's kind of been a bit of a state of flux. But I work with a lot of different organizations and have worked with different areas of business and government and all those kind of things. So in terms of, I guess, what this presentation is going to be like, I speak fast, I speak jargon, I speak really quickly, so hopefully you can enjoy what's actually going to be conveyed here, and the recording will actually be, maybe you can slow it down so you can actually catch some of what I'm about to say, but I'll do my best to kind of keep it at a reasonable pace. I will be taking questions at the end, so I'm actually going to ignore the Q&A at the moment because it's quite distracting, and if you noticed in the previous slide, I have ADHD, so it's very much squirrel over there now. So what are we going to take through? So Teams governance, this is a hot topic. Everyone's talking about it, constantly talking about it, but what does it actually mean? Now, my challenge with Teams when it comes to governance is that people have a very narrow view of what this actually means. And that's the challenge. So if we ever actually look at the platform, now I'm not going to go through a Teams 101, but what is important to note with Teams is that it is a large platform and that every element of it actually has governance components of it. So the chat and the group chat, be it one-to-one or group, that actually has governance components behind the scenes. We've got powerful meetings that actually also have governance features and integrate with other areas of Office 365. The calling and video, surprisingly, has governance functionality and controls that we can apply to it. And then, of course, there's all the apps and the like that we can actually have behind the scenes that flow up through. And so the thing that's important to think about this is that Teams brings and surfaces a lot of Microsoft 365 features and functions. However, we can't just focus on just Teams. So a lot of sessions that I've seen over the last few years when they talk about Teams governance, it's always the same 4 points. Who can create a team? Who can be an owner of a team? What's the naming of the convention of the team? And didn't plan that out well. And what's the expiration policy of the team? That's not Teams governance. That's what's out of the box when it comes to the Microsoft 365 platform and what you can do around Teams, but that is not Teams governance. So when we look at governance, and a lot of people use the term loosely, and I'm not saying that mine is the absolute right way to look at it, but when we look at what is governance, we actually have to think about, well, why are we doing governance? What are we trying to get out of it? What are the tools that are involved? How do we apply controls? Who we apply controls to? Ultimately, we have to think about not just, hey, I want to lock down the environment. Hey, change manager, go train on it. That's not what it's like. It's what's the actual end goal that we're trying to get to? Fantastic. We want to have teamwork. We want to have improved collaboration. Great. Now let's work backwards from that. So we also have to think about why we're doing this, because Teams seems to be the thing that fixes everything, including leaky roofs. So does Teams really fix everything? We have to think about that before we just go throwing it out there. One of the things that's also very important to consider that many organizations have not when it comes to when it comes to Microsoft Teams is the supporting workloads. So there's a lot of features that, as I said, Microsoft Teams sits on top of Office 365. And so there are three key features that we need to have addressed. The first one is mailboxes. We need to have our mailboxes sitting inside of Exchange Online. Why is this important? Because Exchange Online is where content is stored from a e-discovery and retention perspective. So this is crucial. This data has to actually exist. Now, if you haven't migrated mailboxes to Exchange Online, Teams will still work. The problem is, though, the calendaring functionality won't work that well, and you'll have a disjointed experience. The retention and the e-discovery, it is actually still held in a hidden mailbox. But the problem is that other features of the Microsoft 365 platform that surface through Teams will not work. Really good example of this is Planner. Planner relies on your Exchange mailbox being active. So if you haven't been migrated, but your peers have, and they're already using Planner, and you start using it and it doesn't work, are you going to say Planner didn't work? No, you're going to say Teams didn't work. So it's crucial that we actually have a look at that and realize that the mailboxes have to be there. Also, personal drives. So if we implement Microsoft Teams, even if it's just for chat, putting aside teamwork and all those fancy features, and we just look at the personal drives and how we're just improving chat and individual collaboration or ad hoc collaboration, we have to have our content move across from personal drives. We have to have gotten rid of your H drive, your P drive, whatever the drive letter was that was your home drive. We need to be rid of that. That should have been done a long time ago, but if it hasn't, this is the time to do it as part of your Teams deployment. Why? Because if I don't and it's still there, I'm going to be copying files into my OneDrive inadvertently to share them with other people. In Skype for Business, when we sent a file to somebody, it was a point-to-point. It sent it from my computer to their computer and would sit inside of their incoming files folder. With Microsoft Teams, that's not the case. If I send a file to you, it actually stores it in my OneDrive and in the chat. So either if you haven't deployed if you haven't made OneDrive available from a licensing perspective, then the reality is you can't send a file at all. You can't share a file. So you've actually got less functionality than what you had with Skype for Business. But if you have, then we've potentially got duplication. So we have to have addressed that as well. And then lastly, we have to have also looked at shared drive. Almost every single organization I've spoken to that has Teams rolled out to everybody still has shared drives. And the problem is people are picking up, like with their home drives, but worse, they're picking up files and sticking them into Teams and working off them. But this is creating copies of these files. This is creating duplicates. If you're in a regulated organization like any form of government or a publicly listed company or education, those kind of things, that is not acceptable. We actually have to have control around the content and ensure that we're not having duplicate files, not just from a usability perspective, but from a legislative requirement. So these things are absolutely crucial. So one of the things that's also neglected as well is your Office 365 health. So I speak with a lot of organizations that, again, have rolled out Teams, but when I ask them, how long have you been using Office 365? Might have been for 3-4 years, even 2 years. And the reality is they actually haven't looked at the health of their tenant. They haven't looked at the security configuration. They haven't looked at what's available in the message center. They haven't looked at all these different features. One of the things that's crucial is keeping on top of all the updates that come to Microsoft 365 and underneath the Office 365 platform, because there are services that have been turned on. There are features that have been enabled by default because Microsoft wants you to use them, so they're on by default as opposed to off by default. Some of them I'm coming out with off by default, but most are on by default. So this creates quite a challenge because there's a whole security world there. There's a whole feature world there that IT admins are often not aware of. The amount of people who don't know what the Microsoft Secure Score is astounding. And this is a challenge. You need to know what's in that environment before you start stacking things on top of it. It's effectively like saying, hey, I'm going to go build a house in this open block of land. I haven't checked what's underneath and if the ground is sturdy enough to hold my house, but I'm going to build here anyway because it looks nice and it's got a great view. That's the problem, is if we ignore our Office 365 health. The challenge also with all these implementation factors is we have to think about what we're used to is this approach from a project perspective that you would simply go and you'd roll out functionality and it's done. You know, everything was a project. It was simple. It was driven that way. That's not how this stuff works either, because we can't design what the training solution is without figuring out what the actual solution is going to be. A lot of organizations will bring change management in at the end saying, hey, we're ready to deploy, go create some comms, go create some training material. It doesn't work like that. We have to think about, well, what's the user impact? We have to bring change in at the start. And all this actually impacts how we configure, how we plan the Microsoft Teams deployment and its ongoing lifespan. Because sure, I can deploy the Microsoft Teams client to everybody in an organization, bang, done. Wow, look at that adoption, and that's fantastic. Great, but it's bad adoption. I'll talk about that in a sec, because there is such a thing as bad adoption. But all these things factor into it, because am I deploying this to mobiles and desktops at the same time? Am I configuring this feature, that feature at the same time? All these things have to be considered. And the reality is, while there is a somewhat of a sequential process, part of it is also a parallel process, so that some things move up a level, then we have to wait for this one to come up. A really simple scenario is I want to migrate from Skype for Business on premises as a phone system to Microsoft Teams as my phone system, as my collaboration platform, as my meeting platform. Do we just go click, done, migrated in one go? No, and look, the reality is there's no one single answer, but a common approach is say, let's move our meetings across first. Then let's move maybe chat and calling for some people across first. Then let's do teamwork down the end when we've mastered it, we've taken care of things. But at the same time, you could be tying it with things like a Windows desktop refresh so that people have the latest and greatest OneDrive sync client and they can actually push folders down to their machine instead of having to work off the cloud all the time. So all these things add up. And so when we look at what's actually involved in the Microsoft 365 platform, there is a ton of features. Now this little animation is not showing up as well as I would like because it's trying to push smart art and animations across the wire. But the reality is there's a ton of features inside of the Microsoft 365 platform. And about 9 months ago, when I was designing the MS700 Managing Teams exam, we sat down and said, no, the Teams administrator of the future has to be across all this. They can't be necessarily an expert and deep technical expert in every single one of them, but they have to be across everything. They have to understand what happens if I configure a DLP over here. Things like, for example, a retention policy in SharePoint can prohibit you deleting a team. You know, so that's the thing, is if you can't speak that language or you haven't considered these kind of things, that's a problem. If you've got a retention policy that it's on Exchange, but you haven't actually applied it to Teams, it's kind of working, but it's kind of not. So this is the thing, is we actually have to uncover everything that's inside of Microsoft 365, because as I've said a few times, that bubbles up through the surface to Microsoft Teams. Then we have to think of the Teams platform itself. So when I actually do my governance workshops with organizations, I actually have a dedicated governance theme, an entire session, and a whole bunch of content that is focused purely around Microsoft Teams. I do cover things like information sharing and management and external sharing and security and those kind of things, but Teams has its own because it is a platform unto itself at the same time as sitting on top of a platform. So when we look at how do we configure it, we have to look at what are the meeting policies, what are the messaging policies, what are the guest policies? Should guests be able to delete or edit sent messages? Should team owners be able to delete messages? Should we have chat in meetings? Should we disable shared notes inside of meetings? A common tip that I give to pretty much every single customer every time when we talk about Microsoft Teams is disable the shared notes feature. Why? Because in my humble opinion, and apologies if there's anybody from Microsoft on the call, it's rubbish. It is a rubbish feature. It does one thing well at one point in time. That's not sufficient for the modern experience where I'll have a meeting and I come back. So what's better for that? OneNote. OneNote is clearly better for that. Oh, but it's not integrated in my meetings experience, but the shared notes feature is. That's not true. I can actually integrate OneNote into my meeting experience from actually the Outlook appointment, where I can actually attach a OneNote page, section, or even entire notebook itself. And that notebook can follow the meeting. So I can actually have it inside of the Teams meeting, but I can access it through OneNote. I can access it through my mobile device. So why am I going on this tangent about OneNote? Because the ability to turn that feature off and change the usability impact and experience is a policy setting inside of Microsoft Teams. And I can also define that that applies to everybody except some people because they need that. For example, in my Strant consulting tenant, which is my MVP, my private tenant, I actually have in our meeting policy that anybody can join a meeting without actually having to go through the lobby, which is not something I would recommend. But why have I turned it on in my tenant? Well, there's a specific policy that applies to specific people for the duration of this particular conference to allow them to get in without having to wait for someone like me, mainly because I've got a couple of other people involved in the conference planning for M365 May who are not internal. So I don't want to have to give everybody an account just to be able to grant other people access. So all these little things make a huge impact when it comes to user experience. And all the user experience is defined, is built on what are our governance principles, how are we controlling this, and what are we trying to do? So I'm going to pause here and take a photo, and you're going to get your phones out. This is probably the only time I encourage people. Get your phones out, take a picture of the QR code, enter the competition. There's some really good prizes. If you've attended any other sessions, people generally don't know what they are, but I do because I organize them all. So take a photo of that, rules and eligibility apply, those kind of things. Hopefully you've done that. If not, moving on, because there's a lot to get through in a very short session. Now, why is this important? So I talked about a number of features inside of Microsoft 365 that apply to Teams. A really important one is groups. When we create a group, we get different functionality. So my good friend Matt Wade created this amazing infographic that says when you create a team, you get all of these resources. So I'm not going to delve into and dwell on who should be able to create a team. But that's the thing, is we need to think about the fact that every time a team is created, a whole bunch of content is created. So that is a really simple governance thing. And as I said before, that's one of the basic pillars that people rely on. But the problem is, if we decide to go, cool, we're going to address this by restricting the creation of groups, congratulations, you have restricted the creation of groups in SharePoint, you've restricted the creation of groups in Stream, Power BI, and a bunch of other places that actually might need to have groups. But now you've done it to address teams. Knee-jerk reaction hasn't had the best outcome. Also, when we create a group, they're not all the same. Now, my friends at AvePoint created this slide that I've adjusted a little bit, and actually have to update the icons. But when we create a group, what used to be called an Outlook group, also known as a modern group, and now they were called Office 365 groups, and they're now called Microsoft 365 groups, because branding. When we create one of these groups, we effectively get an Exchange mailbox. And because we get an Exchange mailbox, we get an Azure Active Directory group also attached to it. We get a SharePoint team site attached to it, and we can get a planner and those kind of things. And so what's great is I can attach a team to that. If I create a team through Teams, I can clearly attach a team to that. However, if I create a group through Yammer, I can't attach a team to it. Why is that? Because Yammer does not use Exchange as its messaging system, but Teams does. So as I said right at the start, if I don't have a mailbox inside, then I can't do things like Planner. I can't do things like Teams because they rely on that shared mailbox as well as the personal mailbox to work. So I've seen organizations that, from an infinite governance wisdom, IT have removed the create SharePoint site button from SharePoint because it seems logical, but they haven't thought of the bigger picture, because they didn't actually restrict the ability to create groups. So what people were doing was they were going into Yammer, creating a group, getting a SharePoint site, because ultimately that was all they wanted, going in and collaborating. But then after that, the person would say, oh, I want to use Teams, I want to have channels, I want to have meetings. And they'd go to create a team and connect it to the existing group, but it's not there because there's no mailbox, because it's a Yammer group. So what would they do? Go and create a new one. So now I've got Becky's project review as a Yammer group and Becky's project review as a team. That's going to be great from an administration perspective. That's great from a user experience. And what would happen when Becky goes and creates this? Apologies to anybody called Becky, I'm not picking on anyone in particular. Is the person would potentially pick up their files and copy them across. Well, maybe they wouldn't. But we've got conversations that are in one place that I can't move to another. We've got files that are still sitting in one place that may not necessarily have been copied to another. We've got the duplicate team name. It's not a fantastic user experience. And I'll come back to that particular scenario in a little bit and dig a bit further. But when we look at how to create a group, so we've got a number of different ways to create groups. We've got the Office 365 apps like Planner, Power BI, Stream, those kind of things, and obviously Microsoft Teams. We've got an Office 365 admin experience, so I can create it from the administrative, from the admin center. But if I create it that way, it has different ways than if I created it through an app. I can create it through PowerShell. I've got a lot more control over it then. Or I can create it through using the Graph API, which I can actually invoke through PowerShell, and I have a lot of control about what I can do with it. But funnily enough, still not some controls that are inside the web interface. So these things have to be thought about, is not just who can create a group and a team, how are we allowing the creation of groups and teams, and what's our benefit from it? Because there's different benefits from doing that. We'll see if my dog barks. When we actually look at those things like who can create a team, who can be an owner of a team, can we restrict that? And I've had organizations say to me, we want our governance to be that only owners can create groups. That does not work. That's not a feature. You could probably architect that yourself, but it's not something you can do. Apologies, my dog is wanting to get out because somebody is obviously doing something. We've also got things about how should teams be named, what's the expiration policy. I mentioned a whole bunch of these things before. But then let's get into the lifecycle part of it, because it's really easy to control the creation and those kind of things. Let's get into the lifecycle. Now, what happens when you delete a team? What happens to the files? So that organization I alluded to before, they would say, oh, well, before we delete it, we'd take a copy of the files because they're in SharePoint, take them out and put them into another SharePoint location for archival. No, that's not it. We're not done, because you know what? That's a record. Sure, those files, that's important. But what about the conversations? The conversations are a record. The conversations are what we would have normally had as an email that we have historically filed and stuck into a folder somewhere, or maybe printed out, or maybe saved as an attachment because they're important. But that doesn't happen when you delete a team. So what happens with that important content? What happens with things like the planner plans? What happens with content that's sitting inside of SharePoint that is not the files? Things like web parts, things like lists. And also, what about the guests who are also part of the team? Because when you delete a team, you don't actually automatically delete the guest. So they're orphaned, they're sitting in your Azure Active Directory. That might be okay because maybe you want to add them into another team, but what if we don't? They're just sitting there hovering. From their perspective, they can still see your directory, they can still flick into your tenant, they can still message people and see presence and those kind of things. So that's a little bit dangerous. We've got these stale objects sitting there. And also, what about Stream? Stream is a lovely product that does really good things and has a lot of things that it hasn't done yet that it should have. But one challenge is when you delete a group and / team, I talked about all the different things that you're losing, the planner, the messages, the files, those kind of things. You don't lose your Stream videos. They just get orphaned and float away, much like guests, which, to be honest, is disappointing from a product perspective, but that's an issue because those Stream meetings are meetings, they're recordings. So what happens with those? You know, where do they go? Who owns that content from that point? So these things have to be considered from a governance perspective, because it's not just about who can create it and what should the name be, it's what happens afterwards to all the content, not just some of the content. So how important is this stuff? I've kind of harped on a bit about it, and everyone thinks it's important because, well, everybody talks about governance, and there's a bunch of governance sessions here. This is an example of bad adoption. Now, if you're sitting, hopefully you're not looking at this on a mobile phone, you're looking at this on a nice big computer screen. And unfortunately, I don't have the ability to have audience interaction right now. But the problem is there's something very wrong with this picture. The graphs are really big. That's great. The numbers are really high of chat. This is an organization that had 83% adoption of Microsoft Teams and was heralded as a global success. It is a multinational tech company. They have, they had 94% of all usage was chat only. 7,500 people globally. There was 3% of usage was calling and meetings, and 3% was channel conversations. Tell me what's wrong with that picture. That's terrible. Because what are they using it for? A Sky for Business replacement. This is an organization that hid the SharePoint button that allowed groups to be created. So part of the other thing that's not shown in this graph is there's other graphs that show their SharePoint site creation was skyrocketing, but the usage was plateauing. Their OneDrive file creation was absolutely skyrocketing. And why is this? Because without a proper governance foundation and framework and then adoption to support that, what people were doing was just going creating a new team for Becky's project review team. And what would happen is Bob would go, oh, I've been added to another team. He would take the file out of the team, stick it in his OneDrive because that was synced to his desktop, work on it, and then share it back. That's what was happening. People weren't working in teams, they were working in their locations because there was no control, there was no governance. They thought they had governance, but they actually didn't. They actually had the opposite end of it. So other examples of where governance comes into it is not just about who can, come here, Schnauzer. No, you're not going to come here. Great, I'm stuck in this position where the dog is growling, nobody's coming to the door because I'm presenting, and she also won't come to me for attention. But if we look at some real world examples, so private channels are a great feature. They are the most requested feature on user voice. The problem is that private channels, when you create a private channel, there's limitations of how many private channels you can create. You don't have the ability of switching from a private channel to a standard channel and back and forth. They have their own membership management. They create a SharePoint site collection and a bunch of other little quirks behind the scenes. So the problem is that most people haven't disabled the ability for private channels to be created. They may have thought, great, we're restricted in the ability to create groups. Congratulations, you've now got all this other stuff happening behind the scenes. Now she's just going to stare at me. But also sharing links as well. So one thing that I've seen is one organization had disabled external sharing in OneDrive and SharePoint, but they had they allowed anybody to add guests to their tenant. Now, what do you think is better, for me to be able to share an individual document with somebody or to have to invite them in to be a guest in my team and be able to see everything? Come here, you. This is my friend and she's going to present with me. Hello, Pepper. So this is the challenge that we've got, is the fact that people are not fully aware of all the settings. Hello, no. People are not fully aware of all the settings that are available to them, and they're not fully aware of the security implications. I'd much rather share a single document with somebody than to have a guest come in and have access to a whole bunch of content. Don't you agree? No, we're not doing that. We are not that kind of family. And now I'm off my stride. So the challenge is, off you go. How do we manage governance from an ongoing basis? Governance is not a set and forget. It is not I've created a governance document, we're done. That's it, finished. It is not set and forget. It is ongoing. It is continually evolving because new features come along. Tags are rolled out. Who can create a tag in Teams? We have to address that. We have to address a whole bunch of things continually going on. And this is aligned with adoption as well, is we can't just go, you're trained, finished, completed, done, away we go. So that's the thing, is governance has to continue to evolve, as does adoption, and the two of them have to work together. My wife Megan and I will from time to time do a session called Governance and Adoption, Making the Marriage Work, because the two of us work together. We don't do projects separately. We do exist outside of each other. But the thing is that when she does adoption, she says, how's this controlled? What's the governance? Same for me, when I do governance, I say, what's the end objective? How is this going to be communicated to users? What's their experience like? So it's important to actually marry the two together and communicate it, not just create a single page or a PDF or something like that and say, here's how it is. It has to actually be continually evolving. We have to engage the users on a regular basis because this is their tool, not ours. So as I said before, it is not set and forget. There's always new ways of doing things. Teams will add new features. Some things will come to channels or tabs or the Teams client that we have to think about, or the mobile. We have to think about all these kind of things. We have to be on top of them. We have to look at the message center. We have to ensure that our users are empowered to do certain things and discover things on their own and enrich us as IT people, because there is no chance that we can live and breathe everything. I can be sitting here wearing my Microsoft Teams, whatever you call these things, sweatband, wearing a Microsoft Teams t-shirt, and I can tell you that I know a lot about the platform. It is all I do, and all I do about Office 365. But I can tell you I don't know everything. And nobody should ever say that they know everything, because unfortunately the platform is too big and continually evolving to be able to know everything. So we have to continually absorb those changes to continue to look at information and learn from other people and learn from our users, because you know what? They're not stupid. They actually know a thing or two. Maybe they've done something somewhere else that we don't know about, and we can learn from them. So it's important to continue that journey. So with that, I will now open it to any questions, and I'll actually see what the Q&A actually says. Will this be recorded as they have a conflict, not be able to attend? Yes, but that person, I guess, isn't here to find that out. So it's multitasking, yeah, Matt Wade's infographics. Can you provide info for Teams admin certifications? Yes. MS 700 is the exam that you need to go and do. It's not perfect. It's not exactly what I designed. It has changed since we designed it, but it's still a really good starting point. So go off and do that one, and get everybody who touches Teams from an IT perspective to do that one as well. Someone has said, don't call you Becky. They must have resonated as to they create all these different teams. Is there much learning material modules available at the moment for the MS 700 exam? I believe there's a bunch of content available. If you go to the site, to the MS 700 exam page, it actually has jump off points to it. But it's not, yeah, there's still a lot of, I guess, knowledge that you'll need to pick up from along the way. Some of it is on the docs.microsoft.com site. Someone that says Teams was tragically confused with WhatsApp, #wrong user adoption. Yes, absolutely. Microsoft themselves, when they started with Teams, was said a chat-centered workspace. That doesn't resonate well with executives. Chat. Who's going to buy a chat tool? So yeah, it's the wrong thing. It is not a chat-centered workspace. It is a productivity hub that brings all these things together. Chat is one component of that. Without restricting team creation, how do you stop duplicate teams from being created? Assuming naming policies are already in place. Any way to do this natively, or do you have to use a product such as ShareGate Apricot? ShareGate Apricot is a nice product, but is nowhere near powerful enough for what you actually need to do. My personal preference is to use AvePoint Cloud Governance, because it goes considerably beyond any other particular product, but there's also Power Software, who's one of the sponsors as well, Provision Point, and there's a few others there as well. So part of it is you can actually build your own app that actually looks at, hey, this name seems to be familiar before I go and create it and checks. So that's the thing. So we can have a Teams directory where a person checks first before they actually go into it, but then you have issues around private versus public teams. Someone's called out Pepper, so they know my dog's name. That's a little bit concerning, but probably not. She's on Twitter's. Someone says that he's gorgeous. It's a she, but it's a. Someone said, don't call me Becky. Can you take the headband off? No, I can't, Stuart. Have you had much experience onboarding Teams voice? What do you find is the tipping point of IVR complexity requirements before you wouldn't recommend it? That is beyond the scope of a governance-based conversation, but happily for you to ping me offline. And what do I think of the Oppressor Mark II? I've got some friends who are trolling me in here, trying to throw me off my game. Good luck with that. If there's any real questions that people would like to ask before we jump off, please, I'll hang around for a couple of minutes. Can you recommend Teams migration tools? That unfortunately is a very broad question, because it's migration from what to what. If it's migration from Slack to Teams, I know BitTitan has something, I know AvePoint have something, but look into what those are. Cloudyway, I think, has something. If it's file share to migration to Teams, again, broad. So it's what part of Teams? Is it Skype to Teams? It's very broad. What is the best way to test the different settings and the impact they have? Well, with a lot of the Teams features, you actually have policies. So you can apply a policy to a number of people, so you're not affecting the global policy. And you can say that policy is applied to these particular people over here. Let's test it. However, I would say usually before applying a policy and expecting it to come through, wait about 24 hours because Pepper agrees with me. because yes, some of them will appear in 30 minutes, some of them will take longer to appear. So yeah, create a policy, assign users to it, put your settings into it, wait a day, and then see how it affects it. Another question coming through, and I actually got to go because I've got a meeting I'm late for now. You seem to recommend AvePoint for different things. Best overall tool for Teams and 365 in general. It is AvePoint. There are a lot of tools there, but AvePoint goes really considerably further than a lot of the other tools out there. But it comes down to what you want to do and what you're ready for. For some organizations, simply turning off the ability to create groups is sufficient. For some, just having some PowerShell scripts is sufficient that can do some things. It's really up to you. It's very, very subjective. There are some free tools out there like Sales Team Automation has a simple provisioning tool, but there's a very big difference between provisioning and governance and lifecycle, and that's what you need to look at. Somebody's put the URL in there, avepoint.com. That's fine. Can you stop blowing up my car? Yes, my buddies are trying me nice. You didn't expand on how to remove a team. I was hoping for some kind of magical tool to wrap it up and put it into a records archive. No such thing. I'm working with inside of InSync, we're working to build one because no such thing exists, but that is a really big issue. Is there any product or internal feature that enables tenant-to-tenant migration of Teams conversation history? No, there is no internal feature, or there are some off-the-shelf tools. As I said earlier, AvePoint has one, Cloudyway, BitTitan has one. They're not pure tenant-to-tenant migrations, so they'll migrate a lot of stuff, but not everything. So Teams to team from one domain to another, we had issues migrating Planner wiki contents. Yes, you will. Teams archiving. All right, I have to go. These questions are fantastic. What I would suggest is I can't keep answering them here as I do have to get to a meeting. So please find me on the socials, ask me questions there. When we're allowed in person, bail me up at a physical event. And with that, I will say, yes, I agree, Pep. I need to get to that meeting. Thank you to our sponsors who are making this event possible. Thank you to the amazing organisers. Oh, thanks, that's me. No, the other organisers as well who are making this event possible. And please do tune in to a lot of the other sessions. So with that, I say thank you, goodbye. I'm keeping the headband on, whoever said to take it off.